Good afternoon, everybody. So, welcome to our final session. I'd like to introduce Professor Jackie Lumby, who is going to be our chair for today. Before I hand over the baton to her, I would just like to say a few words about our colleague and friend. Professor Lumby is an emeritus professor of education with a primary focus on leading for equity in all parts of education system worldwide. Professor Lumby's main interests are in educational leadership and management, particularly focused on how some learners and staff may be excluded. This has led her to engage with issues of diversity, gender, and power. She is concerned. She is concerned to explore how leaders can be supported to lead people, systems, and processes which offer success to all learners and staff in the context of living a life they value. Her work encompasses a range of perspectives, including critical theory and comparative and international perspectives. She is interested in challenging the assumption of the appropriateness of Western driven concepts, theories, and practice in different cultures and an increasingly diverse UK culture. She has researched and published widely on the leadership and management of schools and colleges in the UK, Ireland, China, Hong Kong, and South Africa. Jackie, I look forward to the next stage with yourself.
Thank you very much indeed, Victoria, for that introduction, and welcome everybody to this final keynote session. I'm honoured to be able to introduce this very significant conference in BELMAS's history. The theme of the conference is looking back and looking forward, and it's particularly fitting to hear a keynote from someone who has contributed to education, leadership and management over a very sustained period of time and in many nations worldwide. Professor Andy Hargreaves is a citizen of the UK, and so it's particularly fitting to welcome back one of our own in terms of the home of BELMAS to deliver this keynote. He comes from Accrington, and for those of you who are not from the UK, this is a town in the industrial north of England, famous for making iron-hard bricks, which hold up the buildings, very important buildings in many parts of the world, and an indication of his still having contact with those roots in the UK is that in 2004, he came back to lay the foundation stone of a new primary on the site of his old primary, and his best teacher, who was well into her 80s, was there. Now that's roots that go back a long way. That's continuity. So he has a lot of credibility in terms of BELMAS's home, the UK, but he also very much works on an international platform. He's president of the ARC Education Group of countries whose ministers and professional leaders need to advance their commitment to broad excellence, equity, inclusion, democracy, well-being and human rights in education systems. Wales, Scotland and Ireland are all currently members of this group. He's an advisor to Nicola Sturgeon, who is the First Minister of Scotland, alongside 9 other advisors, and was involved in the 2015 OECD review of Scotland and the 2013 OECD review of Wales. He's advised the Premier of Ontario. He's a past president of ICSI, the International Conference on Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and is now director of SHANEEN, Change, Engagement and Innovation in Education at the University of Ottawa. Some decades ago, a very famous question was posed as indicating the heart of education, and that is, what do you do with children on a Monday morning when it's raining? When you come in that classroom, what is it you have to do? And I think Andy's keynote is going to go to the heart of that, because leadership is about facilitating teachers coming into that room and engaging children and young people in learning. And having had the disruption and the isolation and the anxiety of a worldwide pandemic, re-engaging our learners, knowing how to get them there on that Monday morning and help them learn is a key platform foundation throughout the world for educators at all levels of the education system. Andy's going to talk about this for about 40 minutes. About halfway, he'll have a short break for some interaction, and then at the end, there'll be a chance for you to make your comments and questions. I'd encourage you to put your comments and questions in the chat box as we go along before you forget them, so that we can really engage with each other, as well as hearing Andy talk about engagement. So I'll now invite Andy to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for that introduction, and to Victoria as well, and all of you for inviting me to join your 50th anniversary virtual birthday party. Please feel free to break open the champagne, the glasses of wine, and anything else you might want to drink if you don't drink alcohol, to celebrate this great anniversary. It is 50 years ago is a time when I was coming to the end of my sociology degree at the University of Sheffield, and beginning to think about training for teaching and going on teaching practice in the city of Sheffield on a council estate, and near the site where the Full Monty was actually filmed in one of its primary schools. So congratulations on your anniversary. It's a great privilege to be with you at this particular time. I'm speaking to you from Ottawa in Canada on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And if you've been following the news over the last few weeks in particular, you'll know that these Indigenous communities, and many Indigenous communities in Canada, have a legacy and a culture that has been significantly challenged over decades by the oppression, neglect, and abuse of policies that separated Indigenous children from their families, their cultures, their language, their identities, with appalling multi-generational consequences as a result of the actions of the Canadian government, the British Commonwealth, and the Catholic Church. And this is a time to think about what needs to be done to repair, restore, and provide reparations for those communities and all oppressed communities all over the world. A lot of my approach to education administration and leadership is framed by my background in sociology and by the contemporary issues that have been heightened by the pandemic that we've all been going through, of inequity, and how it has affected populations of children. 1.6 billion taken out of school all over the world, an average of 95 days for children in the UK, and particularly how it's affected many of our essential workers, the working class, as I like to think of them. And the working class has many colours, by the way. It's a class of many colours. It's not a class of one colour that should be pitted against other colours, and we need narratives that unite the classes across many different backgrounds and identities. And that's part of what will frame the way I'll address you today, to think about engaging leaders so we can engage our students, all our students, before, during, and beyond this particular pandemic. The approach I will take is like a movie, really. So we'll begin by looking at the big picture, the landscape, the parameters of a society in the changing world. and one in particular that I'll share with you. And then we'll have a little transition that'll be interactive, and then we'll go more into the micro world looking out rather than the macro world looking in. And hopefully by the end of this session, we'll be able to see some of the connections between these two. As Jackie said, she mentioned a couple of these things. I'll draw particularly on three areas today in this presentation. The work I've done with ARC and setting up ARC. These 7 systems at the moment that include, by the way, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, but not Northern Ireland and England, around these core values that Jackie mentioned, these humanitarian values. I'll talk a bit, and I'll draw on the work I've been doing with Scotland since 2015, and particularly the group of advisors that I'm part of since over the last 3 years, some of whom you may recognize if you screw your eyes up in this picture, taken before the pandemic. That's why we have no masks on. But you'll recognize people here like Alma Harris, Chris Chapman, Graham Donaldson, and a number of others from the UK, but also internationally, as well as we've been trying to help Scotland move forward and particularly think its way through this pandemic that's hit us. And I'll draw two on a book that's come out just this week, and in fact, an article in the Times Ed, as I still like to call it, yesterday, which is an excerpt from the book on 5 paths of student engagement, research we've done over 7 years in the US Pacific Northwest with a network of over 30 schools in 5 states trying to develop engagement as a way of improving achievement in particularly amongst poor students, indigenous students, Mexican migrant laborers, poor white working class, who were not only impoverished but also isolated from each other at the same time. And so I'll talk a bit about this as well. Let's talk about the pandemic first. So Bob Dylan, Nobel Prize winner and occasional songwriter, said in All Along the Watchtower, those of you who are old enough, there must be some kind, I'm not going to sing, you'll be relieved to know, there must be some way out of here, said the Joker to the thief. There's too much confusion. I can't get no relief. And this is one of my many hiking pictures I show occasionally when I'm sharing slides with people. This is often felt like captures perhaps how we sometimes felt that we're trapped in this pandemic, in this extraordinary crisis. But a quote I won't show you is Leonard Cohen, a great Canadian, who also said, and the picture could illustrate the same thing, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So what's the light that can help us see our way out of this confusion? Well, here's a picture taken on Offa's Dyke on the border between Wales and England, which I hiked in 2019 with my wife and a couple of friends of ours from the US. And this signpost actually exists. It offers you a choice between the world's end going one way as you come out of this crack, this chasm, this confusion, and an expansive and perhaps inspirational and inclusive panorama on the other side. This is in some ways the choice that lays before us now. And I'm trying to press my internet clicker here, and absolutely nothing is happening. So there we go. The World Health Organization in 2018, so this is before the pandemic, and you'll be relieved that I'm not going to read this out, pointing out that this is not the last pandemic. It's not 100 years before we'll see another. There'll be more pandemics, more often, because of the increasingly close contact between human beings and exotic species brought about by intensified population, movement of people around the world, and closer contact between humans and exotic nature. We would also add to this that some of us feel like it's the plagues of Job almost in this last year. Not only have we had a pandemic, but we've had Black Lives Matter. We had just before it, we had Brexit. We've had the manifestations of climate change, of temperatures in Canada this week reaching almost 50 degrees centigrade, never heard of before in parts of the country where you'd least expect it. We have rampant, galloping inequality over the last 40 years, appalling crises hitting us all at the same time. These are not accidental. It's a convergence, not a coincidence. Because really of a particular kind of capitalism that has raged ahead without thought of the consequences for the earth or for those who really produce it and create it, rather than the very, very tiny minorities who benefit most from it. The inequalities that this creates and the devastation of nature mean we're all clamoring for shrinking resources. As the African proverb says, when the waterhole shrinks, the animals all look at each other differently. That's why we have increasing prejudice. That's why we have populist leaders. That's why we have hate and loathing and fear. It's why we have a global refugee crisis, most recently between Morocco and Spain, as people take flight from uninhabitable environments and try to go where opportunities and livable systems still exist. It's why we have Brexit. These things are not accidents, they're not coincidences, they all converge together. And as we come out of the pandemic, we need to think we're not trying just to get over a pandemic, but we're trying to deal with and respond to and get beyond all these other things as well. And a way to think about that is Joe Biden's phrase, also a little bit, you'll hear it in politics in the UK, the idea of building back better. And building back better, I don't know if you know where this comes from, was a phrase actually created first of all by Bill Clinton and George Bush in response to the 2004 Asian tsunami, of which, by the way, my daughter is a survivor because she was in the water in Thailand at the time, taking a short break from work as a consultant with UNESCO Asia. And when Biden and Bush, not Biden and Bush, when Clinton and Bush together talked about building back better, they didn't just mean buildings, hotels, churches, places of worship, businesses, schools. But they also meant the human process of building back better. And actually, we're at a very interesting time because there are statements not just from the OECD, but from the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, UNESCO, that are really talking about a profound transformation in our world needs to be looked at the moment as we come out of this pandemic and into a world beyond that looks at things like racism, prejudice, the threats to democracy, the massive inequalities that we are facing. And so in our upcoming book on well-being in schools with ASCD, which is a large worldwide organization of educational leadership based in the US, we talk about three movements or forces that can uplift all our students in volatile times and respond to these issues that I'm describing. And I'm just going to talk about one of them today. And if you want to see kind of an advanced peek of that, there is an article in a journal that hopefully I will be able to share with you before the end of this presentation that came out in December of last year. And this is about the theme of austerity and prosperity. Now, the response to the 2008 pandemic was not pandemic, but global economic crisis was one of austerity. it was a failure. It was a catastrophic failure. Philip Alston, the UN poverty envoy, described this pandemic as this economic crisis as being utterly callous in the UK because of the effect it had on local authorities, cutting budgets in places like Liverpool by 50% in some cases. It was a time when unemployment in the UK doubled under under Cameron's leadership. And which coincided, by the way, with Cameron going to Martin Seligman, the co-inventor of positive psychology, and thinking the answer to this crisis, even when there was massive austerity and inequality, was to have more cognitive behavioral therapy, which became a condition, by the way, of anybody who applied for unemployment benefits. So I'll come on to this in a few minutes, but austerity and positive psychology are a kind of coincidence. They are not just not just accidental, but they converge. As we've had more inequality, we've had until very recently more looking to cognitive psychology, behavioral therapy, mindfulness, emotional self-management, changing tiny habits as the solutions. These things have populated the TED Talks universe as well. The bigger the social problems have become, the more that people have looked to psychology rather than other areas of social science as the answer. Here's a little quiz for you. Who is the odd man out, literally the odd man out, in these three photographs? Well, some might say there's no odd man out. They're all white men. They're all very wealthy. They're all business innovators with huge fortunes. But the odd man out here is actually Richard Branson on the left-hand side, because his net worth is merely $5.7 billion, whereas £5.7 billion, by the way, whereas the net worth of the other two is, and they compete, is about $180 billion each, and they vie for each other about who's ahead. All three of them are spending their massive fortunes, largely tax sheltered, on seeing who can be the first rocket man who will go personally into space, or as it said in The Guardian, not really into space, but kind of on the ring road of space, along with the carpet discount warehouses of the galaxy, rather than paying their fair share of taxes. And the two on the right being two of the 26 world's richest people, mainly men, who own more than 50% of the world's wealth. And this is why Joe Biden is right to try and lead a global movement to ensure that there is minimum corporate taxation and people cannot hide their wealth, and that instead of taxing income, that the wealth we can tax will actually increase the money that's available for investment in public services and public good to narrow the inequalities beyond this particular pandemic. The opposite of austerity is prosperity. Prosperity not meaning great wealth, but according to the original Latin definition of prosperity, and indeed Dr. Spock in the original shaky film set of Star Trek, it means simply living well. To live long and prosper, not with great fortune and lots of money, but in terms of quality of life. And behind Dr. Spock, or Mr. Spock, I should say, are a lot of economists now, particularly female economists. Mariana Mazzucato in The Value of Everything, Kate Raworth in Donut Economics, who say that actually not just austerity has been a problem in the last 40 years, but the pursuit of a greater wealth at all costs, as measured by the indicators of gross domestic product. This has not created any improvement in quality of life. In some ways, it's led to massive global mental health crises. It's actually increased inequality. It's benefited neither economies overall, nor the different ways we experience them between black and white, rich and poor, and so on. And these economists, kind of British-based, European-based economists. You can add to them Heather Boushey, who is now Joe Biden's economic advisor. So a lot of where he's going with economic policy and strategy is informed by her. Robert Reich, who was the economic advisor to Bill Clinton, who says austerity economics is a dangerous nonsense, a false snake oil for saving the economy by killing it. So the problem of austerity is austerity itself, but also its obverse, which is assuming that the main thing we need to be pursuing is increments every year in economic growth, so we can tax more income to move into the public sector. Whereas what all these people are saying is the major issue is not income. The major issue is wealth and the inequalities of wealth, and how we can and should redistribute that wealth for public good in the future. And this is not a question just of economists, but Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, and now Minister of Finance also, and a graduate of economics, by the way, wrote this book, Plutocrats, who said that although lots of the tech billionaires may have been self-made men, once they earn their wealth, they keep it to themselves. They invested in vanity projects through foundations they set up, and they pass it on as privilege to their own sons and daughters of people like them, rather than redistributing their wealth through fair taxation and public good. And remember, this is not just, next slide, please. This is not just economists here, but a range of political leaders. You'll know what they have in common when you look at the pictures. In addition to Justin Trudeau of Canada, really are now behind this agenda in Iceland, in Scotland, in Canada, in Denmark, in New Zealand, that there's more to life than just GDP, that quality of life is the thing that should be driving us, the prosperity agenda or the prosperity doctrine, as my co-author and friend Dennis Shirley and I like to talk about it. So next slide, please. This is what Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, who I'm a co-advisor for, says is quality of life, economic, collective well-being is more important simply than financial success of an individual or a group or a nation in their own terms. Next slide, please. So here's a little exercise for you. We've taken the big picture of the outside looking in. I've tried to set the agenda. The most important thing actually as we come out of this is not austerity. We need to fight the austerity agenda tooth and nail, and we need to advance the prosperity agenda, which is about reinvesting in public sector, in our schools, in our teachers, in our libraries, in our communities, in our social services, in our mental health supports. These are the important parameters of what's coming next. And once you've done all that, then look at this agenda here. So there's a question coming for you now. Look at this list. As we come out of the pandemic, and stick in the chat box in a second, Which are your top two? Don't put numbers, put words, because I'm going to review them in the chat box. Which are your top two coming out of the pandemic? And which are your bottom two that you think we should focus on? Is it more digital? Is it more learning outdoors? Is it engaging our kids? Is it transforming testing, examinations? Is it dealing and responding and intervening with more tutoring and time with learning loss? Is it well-being, mental health supports? Is it more professional collaboration? Is it looking at equity, increasing equity? Is it supporting school leaders? And is it creating a more agile, flexible, and collaborative system that can deal not just with this pandemic and crises, but with the growing number of pandemics and crises we're going to see? So I'm going to switch on my chat box. There is a 20-second delay as these are moved across from one platform to the other. But just jot down, if you could, your top one or two and your bottom one or two. Remember, it's in words. We're just going to spend a couple of minutes on this, and then I'm going to come back to the agenda with you. Okay, off you go. Yeah, it's open already. I'm just putting my other computer back on because I'm tracking my slides on that. So just hold on. That also just went to sleep, but we're good. How are we doing so far? Okay, all right, good, good. Well, let's, people can tell me. Okay, so we've got, yeah, I don't know why my clicker stopped working, by the way, because it's still on my phone. So well-being, collaboration, equity, student engagement, equity, well-being, mental health, agile system, bottom, digital. Keep coming, everyone. Keep coming. Supporting school leaders, more digital. Keep them coming. Bottom, learning loss. Well-being, mental health, agile system. Well-being, mental health. Okay, good, good. Yeah, bottom, learning loss. Learning outdoors, equity is top. Okay, good. I'm going to stop you in a second. Some names I recognize here. Bernie Marino, welcome. Bottom two, digital learning and transformed assessment. Top two, engagement. And five, learning loss. Agile system, well-being, mental health. Trying to sneak some together here. Okay, I'm going to give you 10 more seconds, but I'm going to keep the chat box. I can see the sun's coming across now, so I'm getting an unearned halo. I'll try and sit back so it doesn't come across. Ron Glatter, hi, how are you? I used to work for Ron a long time ago. Well-being, agile system. Why are any bottom? Yeah. Ken Bryan, yeah. More names I recognize. Learning outdoors, transformed assessment. Okay, keep them coming over the next minute or so, but I'm going to go back onto my slides and let's see if they're still moving. They are suddenly all of a sudden. So here's what we recommended in Scotland. The advisors, all of us together, 10 advisors, December last year, you can see it online there, made 5 recommendations for Scotland. We said this will be very fast. We said we needed a more flexible and agile system, universally designed, which means okay in a pandemic or other crisis, and really, really good not in a pandemic and not in a crisis. So should be able to do both. More networking and collaboration. The strongest systems we've seen worldwide have had, like Wales and Scotland, COVID education recovery groups, where unions, government, parents, health specialists, other partners all work together to decide what, on the basis of the best evidence, but not completely conclusive, what the best response would be. We do think there needs to be more digital. It's going to be essential if we've got other crises. Digital proficiency has increased amongst more teachers. We shouldn't get over exuberant, overexcited, but we all need to be proficient in it. And there needs to be a universal public and free platform that is accessible to everyone and devices, so it removes the inequities. More physical in nature. As a result of this, we've learned that being outdoors more, learning outdoors is good in a pandemic and out of a pandemic. It connects us to our indigenous heritage. It builds early connections to nature that help kids care about the environment and sustainability and climate change. And Nova Scotia, by the way, which is one of the ARC systems, because of this, has just invested $7 million so that every elementary school, primary school, will have an outdoor learning space, not just a playing space, but a learning space. Transforming exams. Let's learn from the last 2 years when kids have not had their conventional GCSE assessments, but have been based more on teacher assessments. And we're getting probably broader access into universities. Let's track that and see what a more inclusive and more open system is. And Alma Harris in particular was behind number 6, but more coaching, mentoring for school leaders. I know some of the MATs in England offer this, and Scotland now offers this to every school principal or school head who wants it. So these are some of the things that we said for Scotland. But what I want to focus on in particular, not just because we've already got a book about it, but because we think it's really important within and outside of a pandemic, is pupil engagement. We don't think the answer is learning loss. The learning loss agenda is dominated by psychologists. Sorry, this loss has 3 S's in here, such a big loss. We thought we'd put an extra S in there. The learning loss agenda is mainly dominated by cognitive psychologists who want kind of interventions and testing. It's a very white field, by the way, is cognitive psychology, certainly in North America and probably also too in the UK. And it's also very linked to the testing agenda and testing organizations. Any sort of set of what the standards are that we've lost or fallen behind. Standards are pretty arbitrary, they're time bound. They will not lead to massive global losses in the overall economy. There's a lot of learning loss after World War II, but by the late 50s, early 60s, the economy was booming, even though loads of kids had experienced learning loss. So they're kind of arbitrary. They serve the interests of testing organizations, and they subject kids to more tutoring, more support, more intervention, more gruel and grit of catching up with standardized exercises and skills, so less engagement rather than more engagement. And we feel what we need instead is the opposite on the other side, which is just, a lot of kids have tuned out, switched off, or walked away, as Helen Gunter and her colleagues were talking about in your conference, walked away altogether. We don't know where they are, where they've gone. And getting kids re-engaged is the most important priority. I have 3 grandchildren in Ottawa. They've been doing virtual learning for 16 months. My wife has been with them every single day of those 16 months to support them, by the way, while I've been doing things like this and then popping over when I can to provide support and relief. And I asked my 8-year-old grandson, I actually asked all of them, what are the good things and the bad things about learning with technology at home? And my 8-year-old grandson said, well, the really good thing about learning with technology at home is you can walk out of class and your teacher can't stop you. And I think he kind of got it in a nutshell there as to what the limitations are of learning at home with technology. So let's see what it means to get our kids re-engaged. Well, if you take engagement as the key thing, it's the lever to learning. Particularly kids who are disadvantaged will find it hard to learn if they're not also engaged. Other kids can sort of grit their teeth and bear it, but if you've got many distractions or disadvantages in your life, it's hard to learn unless you're also engaged. And it's also a window into well-being, because we're pretty sure a lot of kids won't get engaged unless they're well, if they're bullied, if they're ill, if they're not there, if they are worrying, if they're stressed, if they're anxious, if they're depressed. It's very hard to get engaged. So engagement is kind of opens the doors on both sides of these other two things that you've all said are important. Our book on well-being is based on this work in the Pacific Northwest I mentioned before. Here are the 5 states we work with. The non-negotiable of the big federal grant that was behind this initiative was to narrow achievement gaps in the between advantaged. You have. I can hear everybody talking in the background. Do you want me to keep talking, or what do you want me to do? Just keep going. Okay, I can hear everybody in the background. Apologies. So can I just keep going, please? And you could perhaps communicate in another way. Yeah, apologies for that. So these are the 5 states. To narrow achievement gaps, to address inequity, it was the teachers and the schools that decided that engagement was the issue. They did things like surveying their kids on student engagement, because they wanted them to be engaged with their learning, their communities, and their life. Actually, they tried looking at videos of student engagement and creating observation schedules. But the key thing they did was they decided, when they met physically twice a year, but also online virtually, to collaborate with each other, with teachers like them in the same subject, the same year level, to develop interdisciplinary units of work that they felt would engage their kids. And this was mainly what we looked at in terms of the work that they did. So we followed them on engagement. They didn't follow us. And the result of it is this book on 5 paths of student engagement. So we not only looked at what we saw, the data, but we looked at the literature on student engagement. 5 theories. We think there are 3 myths. And what I'll conclude on is talking about the 5 enemies of engagement, which is where leaders can make a huge difference. The psychological literature, which dominates this field, comes up with a truism that is very important, and we build on that, we add to that, that kids are engaged behaviorally. They're either there or they're not there, awake or asleep, eyes on the teacher or eyes not on the teacher. They're engaged or not cognitively, they're interested or they're bored, they're curious or they're not, they're challenged or they're not, and they're engaged emotionally, they're excited or they're turned off, they're enthused or they're disconnected. So all this, and we'd add a fourth, which is spiritual, and we'll kind of come on to that in a few minutes. So this is a kind of common theme across the psychological literature. A lot of the psychological literature, by the way, is the 840-page handbook of student engagement. Is probably the most boring book I've ever read. It is a book mainly of psychologists who've worked on engagement through blind control studies, laboratory experiments, student volunteers, experiments with monkeys. Here's Harry Harlow in 1943, or metadata. Almost no research on real live classrooms and teaching and learning. There isn't one mention of poverty in the whole 840-page handbook, or indeed of technology. There's no kind of social conception of where student engagement is. Far smaller literature from sociology. Pedro Nogueira, Hal and Mel Lawson, father and son team. These are two of the few people who've talked about engagement from a more sociological perspective. But we review 5 psychological theories, the more accessible and ones that are widely used, and you're going to get a sentence on each one. Here's Harry Harlow in 1943, who found with experiments with monkeys that they solved puzzles not because of the rewards that they could get, but because of how interesting the puzzles were. So he came up with the theory that is now common to all of us of intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. Here's Herbert Maslow, also in the 1940s, who came up with his hierarchy of needs, so important during the pandemic, not just at the bottom end, sleep, safety, security, food, water, shelter, but also at the top end of what he called self-actualization. After staying with the Blackfoot Indians later in life in the north of the United States, he added to this, which was not just self-actualization, but also self-transcendence, a kind of spiritual component to well-being. Although Cindy Blackstock, an indigenous writer, has since criticized Maslow for seeing this entirely in individual terms, whereas indigenous communities see well-being in community and collective terms. Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow is one that's had a large influence on concepts of motivation and socio-emotional learning. He talked about we experience flow, feeling totally absorbed, lost in what we're doing, when we have an interest in it, when our skills are at a high level, and when we're continuing to challenge ourselves or other people challenge us at the limits of those skills. And then there's mastery too. This is not just Benjamin Bloom's concept of mastery learning as incremental learning, but also people like Peter Senge's idea of mastery, really like a master craftsperson or creating a masterpiece, a master baker, where it's really a challenge of the self as well as a challenge of the skill that's going on in terms of motivation and engagement. And last is interesting and very highly psychologist Jacqueline Eccles, who, this is very important in Girls and Science, by the way, that the engagement is about something you think you can do and something you also want to do. So both of these things are important. She said that often in the way we taught science, many girls thought they could do science, but they didn't particularly want to because science wasn't presented in a way that engaged them. So feeling you can do it, but also wanting to do it, these are important parts of motivation and engagement too. So we have a lot to learn from psychology, but it's not everything. Engagement, the original meaning of engagement, two of its meanings are: one, it's about marriage, a promise. It's kind of a fun or pleasurable thing, but it's also a battle. A century before that, engagement with an enemy. There is, by the way, only one slight difference in letter ordering between the words marital and the words martial. When we go back and put these two meanings together, we realize engagement isn't always about happiness, fun, or pleasure. Not to disrespect marriage, mine is heading up to the 50 years mark pretty soon. And like most marriages, it's had both of these things at different times. Engagement, therefore, is a promise and a battle. It's both of these things. And therefore, we should beware of three myths of engagement. First, engagement doesn't always have to be relevant and world-changing and related to your life. It's not only that or always that. Therefore, Michael Fullan, in his new Pedagogies for Deep Learning project, Engage the World to Change the World, or Jeannie Oakes and Linda Darling-Hammond, who also talk about deep learning, have got part of what it means to be engaged with your learning. But this doesn't account for why kids are interested in the Harry Potter movies, or Where the Wild Things Are, or Frozen, which have nothing to do palpably on the surface with relevance or existing interests. Second is, engagement is not always about technology. We've seen a lot of technology projects in the schools that we've been working with that can increase interests, that are useful for kids who have special needs, that can connect teachers across distant schools. But during the pandemic, the Washington Post collected children's drawings of what it was like to learn digitally at home. And here's one that shows happiness way behind sadness with anger catching up, or a 6-year-old sitting in front of a computer all day just shouting no, 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 because the excess screen time, as my 6-year-olds grandchildren have complained about, just gives them a headache when they've been at it all day. And nor is technology just fun all the time. I'm not against fun, but climbing up a mountain in lashing rain isn't always fun. Training for a marathon isn't always fun. Trying to stretch your fingers to master the bar chords on a guitar rather than the simple chords isn't always fun. Learning will involve sacrifice and sometimes even suffering in order to achieve something of great value. And our job as teachers and leaders is to help people through this. So let's go to, I'm going to come back to this later on. Remember this is the Shanine Charter that my colleagues at the University of Ottawa and I have described to take a kind of positive but also prudent and skeptical approach to digital learning in schools. I'll return to this at the end. But the key part and the closing part I want to draw your attention to, where leaders can make a difference, is this. We know that engagement is important. Actually, every teacher on the planet practically knows that engagement of kids in their learning is important. We've had endless books in the last few years on how to engage your kids more, loads of workshops, but roughly what the literature shows from OECD and elsewhere is about 20 to 40%, depending on the culture and the age group of kids, are disengaged from their learning a lot of the time. And the numbers aren't improving. Why is this? And it's not because we need to wag our finger at teachers with more surveys, more observation schedules, more rubrics. so that now Ofsted can go in and judge, are you really engaged, getting your kids engaged or not? Well, you need to sharpen up and get more aware here. Or are there things getting in the way of student engagement that we can address as leaders and attack? And we say in the book, there are 5 enemies of engagement. So when your kids are disengaged, are they really in Max Weber's world of bureaucracy, standardization, the arch enemy of engagement, as we call it, which is standardized testing, that is an iron cage of bureaucracy that steals the magic and the creativity from learning and teaching? How can we organize to bring those tests to an end? How can we tell our teachers that the tests are not the most important thing, but bringing creativity and magic into learning is? Or second, are we in Karl Marx's world of alienation from what we're producing, from how we're producing it, from who we're producing it with? Do we make learning too individual and competitive? Do we produce it for the grade or the exam result or the Ofsted inspection? When you're ahead, is the first thing you mention in your talking about your brilliant leadership how your school has done on its Ofsted or how it's done on its SATs? Do we produce learning for the teacher's praise and for the teacher's approval rather than for the intrinsic meaning and purpose of the learning? One thing I've enjoyed about working in Scotland is going around schools. And in those schools, because the curriculum for excellence really tries to emphasize meaning and purpose, is children are taught to understand and be able to articulate what they are learning and why they are learning it. Even when it's algebra, even when it's square roots, even when it's your times tables, kids can tell you what they're learning and why they are learning it, other than just for the grade, the result, or the teacher's praise. This is the world of Karl Marx. And now we've had the liberal Weber and the radical Marx. And now let's add in the conservative Emil Durkheim, who showed us that rates of suicide varied depending on how cohesive or not, and inclusive or not a community was. This is why these days suicide is highest amongst groups such as our often broken Indigenous communities in Canada, with the legacy of abuse that they've had to carry, or amongst our LGBTQ students who've historically been marginalized within their schools and not included, or in the hyper-competitive examination-driven nations of Southeast Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, where rates of adolescent suicide are sky high. So is the third problem one of disassociation, of lack of attachment and belonging? When I visit schools in Norway and see them singing songs about peace and inclusion and belonging, this hasn't always happened, but it was a deliberate drive after Anders Breivik murdered scores of adolescents on an island in Norway. And Norway responded not by increasing security or senses of threat, but building attachment and belonging at every level within their schools. In Ontario, there is a student committee that meets with the government, and which brings us on to our next theme, that gives feedback on where the policies are or are not impacting on the schools. It's a deliberate policy strategy to include student voice. Because just as teachers don't like to feel that they are responding in COVID and elsewhere to a set of arbitrary and suddenly announced policies and impositions. So do students not want to feel that the curriculum is a set of arbitrary and imposed requirements that come from nowhere and on which they're not consulted, however well meant those arbitrary positions and requirements are. So do our students feel disempowered? Here we turn to the literature of Stephen Lukes and his classic descriptions of power, but also to modern theories of power, feminist theories of power, Foucauldian theories of power, about the very language that we use that excludes students, the language of behavior management strategies that are so popular with Bennett and the evidence-informed or evidence-based, as they call it, education movement. When we talk about exclusion or oppression and responses to it in languages of emotional self-management that make kids calm down so that they can carry on, or in languages that rephrase hunger and starvation as food security or food insecurity. So is disengagement really disempowerment? And last but not least, is where and how are our adolescents and all children distracted by the excesses of digital technology? A recent research in the US shows the majority of adults now check their phones more than 160 times per day. And we know that adolescents do this more than the adults do. Watch Ackley Bridge, where you'll see now movies have to show the text messages that are constantly coming backwards and forwards amongst the adults and amongst the kids. The answer is not to be like France and to ban digital devices in schools. If you continue to make the teaching boring, didactic, centralized, standardized. But the answer is to think, how do we get, with and without technology, more focus, more discipline, more senses of mastery, more concentration in what we do within our learning. This is not only important for engagement, but also for the mental health of young people, because we know in the UK, a EU government survey recently showed that 30% of adolescent girls or more continuously enhance images of themselves online because they're ashamed of how their appearance projects to others around them. So in closing, what I have tried to do, could we show the next slide, please? Actually whip through the next few slides, and the next, and the next, and the next, and the next, and to the last. So, no, go back to the picture if you would. So what I've tried to say today is that as we come out of not just a pandemic, but Black Lives Matter, rampant inequality, a world beset by crises of climate change, the divisions of Brexit, successions of refugee crises, that as we respond to all of these, we first need to be driven not by austerity and growth, but by quality of life and prosperity for all, not just a few, but prosperity for all. And we're at a key moment when we can do this, because more and more of our government leaders, particularly women leaders and the economists who support them, are behind this agenda now for more inclusion, more equity for all our children and their families. And that a key way to get into this in our schools is by thinking how we engage our kids, not just more devices, not just with more fun, or not just even with more relevance, but with the multiple pathways that will reconnect them with their learning, get them excited about learning and get them focused and concentrated on seeing through what we've got them excited about to a high level of mastery. The Welsh say, when you have despair or problems or adversity. I don't know how good your Welsh is. There may be one or two people on there is, but what this phrase says is, and this is another of my Offa's Dyke pictures, from adversity comes knowledge. From knowledge comes wisdom. And then we would want to add, last of all, and then from wisdom should come concerted collective action to create a better world that this pandemic has shown we desperately need to build back better together. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Andy. That was so stimulating on so many different levels. I will put my comments in at the end, but I think before we do that, we have about 5 minutes perhaps to pick up one or two questions from participants. The first one's from Dr. Diane Gomery. She says that Scotland and Wales do education differently from England. And she asks, what's the main barrier to England adopting similar policies and strategies that may lead to a more democratic form of education? Now, I know you've worked with many of these countries, so what would you say is the main barrier to England being more democratic?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say cynically is Scotland and Wales have a common enemy, which is England, and so that really helps them. I speak like half in jest but wholly in earnest, and so not being like England, I think, is quite important. And what both Scotland and Wales have managed to do, I think, historically, is to develop an identity that is not just a negative in England, but is basically a very positive thing in itself. Both have very powerful traditions of learning and education and valuing teachers and quality teachers that go back over 100 years, and they've not instantly done that. You know, I was on an OECD review of both Scotland and Wales in the 2013 and 2015, and Scotland still had that, but Wales had lost sight of it, of who they were as a nation, what their heritage was. So they needed a little bit of help, frankly, to reconnect with their strengths and with their pride, and connect that to the kind of modern, more diverse identity of what Wales is moving forward. The problem in England, I think, is England's a very complicated country. I come from the north. We often felt we were in a totally different country than the south. There were like two different worlds disconnected from each other. So the challenge is to try with this very complicated world England has now of multi-academy trusts, of semi-privatization of the public system, is to really think as a nation how the collaboration across chains can become collaboration across communities, how we can make community again the focus, not the individual child, not the individual school, not even the individual chain, but really working and building around communities to create a stronger nation together. I think that is quite political sometimes, but I think we've all been through this pandemic together. We've suffered in different kinds of ways, some a great deal more than others. But there is, I think, quite possibly a kind of post-World War II spirit that we can build on, of wanting a world that is fairer, that is better, that is more inclusive, and that will benefit everyone. And this is a key moment, I think, when we can build on that.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions and a comment. I think what I'll do is I'll give the comment because I think it's very pertinent, and then I'll take one more question because we are running out of time. The comment is from Yoon Young Lee. She says suicide is a big problem, but there are also many important positive aspects, and she hopes to have a chance to share East Asian researchers' perspectives, and I hope too that those perspectives can be
Yeah.
shared. The final question then
can I just comment on that briefly? Because I really want to thank you for the question. I made a very small passing comment about East Asia, Southeast Asia. I do quite a bit of work in South Korea, and I'm a visiting professor in Hong Kong. Much of my work's been translated into Japanese, so I really welcome this. I think important in South Korea, for example, has a network of now over 1,500 schools, which are opposed to the competitive examinations of trying to get into the three sky universities, of building innovation and connecting it to peace and dignity. I think East Asian countries show that our concepts of well-being and engagement actually vary across different cultures. They're more collectivist. Self-actualization isn't as important as an individual thing. It's collective commitment to the family and to the nation. So it can help us all think differently about what is well-being. And so there's lots more there, Anna. Thanks for your question. And please send some of your work to me. I'd love to see what you're doing. I've learned a lot from East Asian perspectives, and I should say all my 5 grandchildren are biracial children, in which East Asian heritage is a very big component. So we live this within our family as well.
Okay, thank you. I have a question now that I think is very key. It's from Tiffany Bastin, and she asks, how are political leaders engaged to support the efforts in Scotland? And I'm going to just widen that slightly, because I think many of us are interested. Scotland may be an example, but how do we engage political leaders to help leaders in schools, colleges, universities to deliver this kind of re-engagement you've been talking about?
Well, first you vote for the right ones. You don't vote for the wrong ones. I think that's a really good place to start. Second is in Canada, in various provinces, we have they're not foolproof, but they help. We have a Take Your Member of Parliament to School Day, and so pretty much all members of Parliament go to school. Hopefully, they don't just go to Eton, but they go to state schools, and it's sometimes quite transformative. They actually come to see and understand what it is at school, and it's an ordinary day at school. It's not a special showcase. It's not a photo op. And frankly, they learn what teachers often have to put up with, what they're able to do in often extraordinary circumstances. I think one of the good things about learning at home is lots of families and lots of people have thought, my God, but I couldn't do that. I have enough difficulty kind of keeping my eye on 2 kids. Imagine keeping my eye on 30. So anything that gives people a window into what's other than the twice yearly report cards is including a member of parliament, or your local government elected people is really helpful. So take your MP to school day. I'd say think about that as something that you could introduce.
Thanks. Again, another really key question from Nidal Al-Haj Sleiman. The question is, with growing populations of migrants across the UK and Canada, teachers find it hard to cope with the cultural and language barriers of migrant children. And she asks for your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so we've seen this is something that will increase, that is not going away. This could take an hour, I think, but
Yes.
some of the things we've seen in Canada are one of the schools we talk about in our book is a school that adopted a Syrian refugee family. So it didn't just like study Syrian refugee, but actually adopted, raised money, provided a home, interacted, supported them throughout the year. Another school has a word of the day, like lots of schools for young children, but it will pick a word of the day in Arabic. And then the other kids said, wow, that's an interesting word. Can we have other words in Arabic as well? So in part, it's we have a phrase here in this province, not under this government, but under the previous government. What's essential for some kids is good for all kids. So what's called land-based learning is really good for Indigenous kids because culturally they learn a lot from the land. But learning outdoors is good for all kids. So connecting with the spiritual environment, very good for Indigenous kids. But having a spiritual, not religious, but spiritual component to your learning is actually good for all kids. If I could give one small example, we had 3 weeks ago, you'll have read a young man, white man, 20 years old, took a flatback truck. By the way, he was homeschooled along with his other 6 children, so had no community or association. Took his truck and drove into a multi-generational family in a town where my nephews and nieces live. 3 generations Islamic Muslim family. It's awful. So it shows we're not a perfect country by any means here. And when they had a vigil for this, they had news anchors commenting on the vigil. And part of the vigil was an Islamic call to prayer. And one news anchor talked and then another. Then we had a third news anchor, Janella Massa. Janella Massa is a Muslim and she wears a hijab. And she's equivalent to a BBC news anchor. And in the midst of all this, she said, you know, normally when we hear the call to prayer on the news, it's associated with chaos or violence or terrorism or threat or fear or otherness. When I hear the call to prayer, she said, on national news as an anchor, when I hear the call to prayer, it's a call to peace. It's a call to community. It's a call to belonging. And the fact that as a new newsreader, we have black newsreaders in Britain, we have a range of newsreaders in England, but to have a Muslim newsreader with a hijab enabled the whole country to connect with that event that would have been probably utterly impossible otherwise. So we have to think about our refugees as an asset and as an addition and as an enrichment to all our understanding and our culture, and not as a subtraction in every sphere of work and life that we are in.
Thank you. The questions are rolling in. People have obviously been very interested. And I am sorry indeed that we can't pick up all the questions that people have asked. There was one about teacher hubs and how they can exert influence. Yeah. The comment from somebody on how we can reduce the exam-oriented culture, which I think has links to what you termed raging capitalism. There were so many interesting comments and questions, but we are out of time. So apologies to those who were not able to directly engage with Andy through your question. I think what Andy has done for all of us is place where we are in a context which is not just global, but almost planetary, a kind of moment of crisis for humankind in a variety of ways. And he's linked that to our role, which we all have, in helping others learn as being vital. He's reminded us that we have to draw on a whole range of sources of knowledge from different disciplines, and that re-engaging our learners, which is going to be the foundation of our world moving forward, is about engaging diverse people, diverse children, and that there isn't going to be one way of doing this, but there needs to be multiple strategies which are smart, which draw on psychology, which draw on sociology, which draw on the experience that we as leaders and as teachers have to meet the needs of children who are in poverty, who face prejudice, who face discrimination, who have perhaps life experience behind them which we cannot even begin to imagine. So we need to work together, both in the microsystem within our organisations and at the macro level with our politicians and other professionals, to try to achieve what Andy has shown us as pathways to trying to draw our learners in and help them learn so that they can, in their turn, build a better future. So thank you very much indeed, Andy, for what you've offered to us this afternoon. I hope we can all take something away and learn ourselves and put it into action, because that is something you asked us to do as well. So on behalf of all of us watching and participating today, thank you very much indeed for sharing with us your experience and your thoughts. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Deborah Oathwaite, who is going to come up with some closing comments to draw the conference to an end.